Hello again and welcome back. This is a part 2 to the marriages and divorces release. So here we'll be looking at a Power BI visualization. So let's begin. For our first panel, we have the crude marriage and divorce rates by province. That is the per 100,000 of the population rates in 2022. So this is done in the same format as the release, where we look at civil marriages, customary marriages, civil unions, then divorces. Looking at the customary marriages, we see higher rates in the western part of the country and lower rates in the eastern. Moving on to customary marriages, as previously noted, we see higher rates in the more rural provinces of the Eastern Cape, Mpumalanga, Limpopo, and to an extent KZN. And looking at civil unions, we see higher rates in the more urbanized provinces of the Western Cape and Gauteng. Again, noting that the civil unions and customary marriages rates are more kind of like a mirror of each other, with provinces with high customary marriages having low civil unions and the other way around. Now looking at divorces, we have the highest rates or crude rates of divorce in the Free State and the Western Cape. Interestingly enough, Free State and the Western Cape also have very high rates of marriages. All right, on the right here we have a percentage bar graph. So same data represented in a percentage bar graph. Now it might not initially make sense why one would want to add marriages and divorces and then create a percentage, but the way one should kind of think of this is more of a index, with marriages pushing from the 0% upwards and divorces pushing down from 100%. So it's a kind of index where below 50% we have more divorces than marriages, and above 50% we have more marriages than divorces. And the marriages are still split into their civil, customary, and civil unions categories, so we can see the contribution of each of these components to the total marriages. All right, then moving on. Okay, sorry, just a note as well, I've left out the legend for this graph, so I've kept the same color scheme of blue for civil marriages, green for customary unions, and yellow for civil unions, with red for divorces, so that these graphs can sort of be used as the legend as opposed to taking space with a explicit legend for this. Okay, moving on to absolute versus crude rate. So absolute numbers versus the crude rate. So this refers back to part 1, where I commented that the release had a lot of absolute numbers, and it may not be clear whether this is a reflection of the actual population distribution amongst the provinces, or genuine propensity for people in those provinces to get married or divorced. So in this case, in this panel, I compare the two. So I look at absolute numbers and the crude rate. So the crude rate accounting for population values in the provinces. And so just in the middle here, we have a table of the crude rates, and on the side we have population numbers, which is what essentially the crude rate kind of normalizes for. And the comparison here is between the absolute numbers and the crude rate, where these two bottom visualizations are controlled by the slicer on the side. So let's just have a look at it. First, looking at civil marriages. Looking at the absolute numbers, we see that we have the most civil marriages in the Western Cape, Gauteng, and KZN. Now, this is unsurprising because these are the most populous of our provinces. So shifting over to the crude rates, which we looked at before, we now see that the highest marriage rates are in the sort of western parts of the country. So we see that KZN has moved from being one of the highest in terms of absolute to being mid in terms of the crude rate. So this tells us that the absolute numbers here are kind of a bit more of a reflection of the population numbers rather than the actual rates of marriage in the provinces. So similarly, having a look at civil unions, we see that the highest number of civil unions are in, again, the Western Cape, Gauteng, and KZN. Looking at crude rates, the Gauteng and the Western Cape still among the highest. Also, KZN still seems to retain its position. So absolute numbers and crude rates are in alignment here. Absolute numbers are not throwing us off. And looking at customary marriages, we still see that in terms of absolute numbers, Limpopo, Mpumalanga, KZN, and Eastern Cape are still amongst the highest. The rural provinces having higher numbers of customary marriages. Looking at the rates, we now see here that they are still in alignment, the more rural provinces having higher rates, but we'll notice that KZN and Mpumalanga sort of switch positions. So absolute numbers give the impression that KZN has more customary marriages than Mpumalanga, but looking at it from a relative perspective, Mpumalanga would have more than KZN. So this absolute number here relative to Mpumalanga is actually more a consequence of the significantly higher population of KZN compared to that of Mpumalanga. And finally, having a look at the divorces. Again, from the absolute side, we are seeing the Western Cape, Gauteng, and KZN having the highest number of divorces. And this is clearly a consequence of them having greater population numbers, because when we switch over to the rates, we see that Gauteng and KZN have kind of dropped off and given way to Western Cape still being there, but now the Free State being the number one in terms of crude divorce rates. So absolute rates absolute numbers sometimes don't reflect the actual divorces or marriages, but merely are a reflection of the population distribution across the provinces. Whereas when we look at crude rates, we can just adjust for that and have a sort of clearer picture. And that's what this whole comparison panel is really about. And yeah, thank you.